The Amazon River moves more water than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. We can see it from space. Satellites trace its brown, winding body through the green of the rainforest for thousands of miles, and scientists have measured its flow, mapped its basin, counted its tributaries. We know roughly how much water pours into the Atlantic every single second. And yet, ask someone a simple question. What does the floor of the Amazon actually look like? And the honest answer is, we don't really know. Not completely. Not in the way you'd think a river this famous would be known by now. Here's the strange part. We've photographed the surface of Mars in more detail than we've mapped the bottom of this river. We've sent robots to the deepest trenches of the ocean floor. But the Amazon, flowing right here on our own planet, through one of the most studied ecosystems on Earth, still hides its own floor from us. Somewhere down there are buried channels from rivers that existed before this one. There are shapes in the mud that might be ancient riverbeds, might be sediment formations, might be something else entirely. Nobody's entirely sure because almost nobody has actually gone down to look. Not properly, not for long. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. I check them constantly, and it's wild to see. Sao Paulo at midnight, Toronto at dawn, someone in Manila already having their coffee, while someone in Lisbon is just closing their eyes. All of us drifting off together to the same river story. Also, if you'd rather listen without ads or music interrupting the flow, I've got this show on Spotify too. It's ad-free, music-free, just the voice and the story, so you can actually stay asleep. Links in the description if you want to follow along there instead. Now, back to the river. Why is this so hard? Why can't we just send a submarine down, turn on some lights, and see what's there? Well, that's exactly what this episode is about. It turns out the reasons stack up like layers of sediment themselves. There's the water, thick with suspended particles, swallowing light within inches of the surface. There's the mud, a shifting, unstable floor that reshapes itself with every flood season, burying yesterday's landscape under today's silt. There's the sheer force of the current, capable of dragging equipment, divers, even boats off course in seconds. There's the life in that water, creatures we've barely catalogued, some of which make careful human exploration genuinely risky. And then there's the human side of it, the logistics of reaching remote stretches of river, the funding required, the political boundaries crossing multiple countries, each with its own rules about who gets to explore what. And underneath all of that, there's history. Centuries of indigenous knowledge that mapped this river long before Europeans arrived, expeditions that came later and still barely scratched the surface, quite literally, of what lies beneath. So tonight, we're going to slowly work through all of it. Water, mud, movement, life, logistics, and history, piece by piece, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a river that never really stops moving. Let's start where the story always has to start, with the water itself and just how much of the Amazon River actually means. When people say the Amazon River, they're actually talking about something far bigger and far stranger than a single body of water. The Amazon isn't one river, it's a system, a sprawling network of a main channel, hundreds of major tributaries, countless smaller side channels, and floodplains that stretch out for miles in every direction. Some of those tributaries are rivers that would be famous anywhere else in the world. The Rio Negro alone carries more water than the Congo. The Madeira could swallow most European rivers whole, and all of them feed into this one system, this one word, Amazon, that barely captures what's actually happening beneath the surface of the land. So when someone asks what's beneath the Amazon River, the honest first answer has to be beneath which part. Because the riverbed itself isn't one consistent thing. In some stretches, the main channel plunges into deep, narrow trenches, water moving fast and dark over a floor that might sit 60, 70, even close to 100 feet below the surface. Just a short distance away, that same river can spread out into wide, shallow floodplains where the water barely covers your knees, slow, sunlit, almost gentle by comparison. Two completely different underwater worlds, sometimes only a few miles apart. And this changes depending on where you are along a river system that stretches over 4,000 miles from the Andes to the Atlantic. That scale is really the first thing that has to sink in. The Amazon basin covers roughly 2.7 million square miles. That's larger than the entire continental United States minus Alaska. Now imagine trying to map the floor of a river system spread across an area that size, most of it accessible only by boat, some of it not accessible by any vehicle at all. Every scientific challenge you can think of, funding, equipment, travel time, safety, gets multiplied by distance and remoteness here in a way that smaller, more accessible rivers simply don't experience. A research team studying a river in, say, Germany or the northeastern United States can drive to a bridge, set up equipment, and be home for dinner. A research team studying a remote stretch of the Amazon might spend days just getting to the starting point, and then there's the seasons which complicate everything even further. During flood season, the Amazon doesn't just rise, it expands, sometimes swallowing entire forests, turning trees into underwater landscapes, pushing the river's boundaries outward by miles in every direction. What was dry land in August might be 20 feet underwater by March. This means the river bed itself isn't a fixed, stable thing you can return to and measure again next year. It moves, it grows, it disappears and reappears in different places. So the methods that work perfectly well on smaller, calmer, more predictable rivers, the sonar sweeps, the fixed monitoring stations, the seasonal comparisons, they don't scale cleanly here. Not when the river itself refuses to sit still long enough to be measured the same way twice. If the Amazon were made of glass, if you could look straight through it the way you look through a clear mountain stream, a lot of our problems would vanish overnight. Divers could see, cameras could see, lasers and sonar would get clean, sharp returns. You could lower an instrument and actually know what it was pointed at. But the Amazon is about as far from glass as water can get. Every second the river is carrying away parts of a continent. Grains of sand scraped off Andean peaks, clay and silt from eroding banks, organic particles from decaying leaves and soils. Mix all that into water and you don't get a crystal stream. You get something closer to liquid earth. Scientists sometimes describe the Amazon as one of the muddiest rivers on Earth. But that word mud doesn't really capture it. This is a conveyor belt of sediment so dense that in some places you can't see your own hand a few inches below the surface. Light doesn't just fade with depth, it gets swallowed almost immediately. The river becomes opaque. That has two big consequences for anyone trying to explore what lies beneath. First, your eyes are almost useless. Traditional underwater cameras, which work fairly well in clear lakes or even in many parts of the ocean, suddenly become blind. The suspended particles scatter and absorb the light from camera lamps, turning images into hazy brown fog. Divers, when they can go down at all, often describe feeling rather than seeing the bottom hands running over unseen sand, cables or tree trunks. Second, a lot of our instruments start to struggle too. Sonar, our go-to technology for mapping underwater landscapes, relies on sending out sound waves and reading the echoes that bounce back from the bottom. But when the water is full of suspended particles, those particles themselves start to scatter and reflect the sound. Instead of a clean echo from the riverbed, You get a smeared, noisy signal from everything between the sensor and the floor. It's like trying to listen to a single voice in a stadium full of people all talking at once. Engineers can compensate for some of this. Different frequencies, signal processing tricks, careful calibration. But there's a hard limit to how clearly you can see through a moving cloud of sand and silt. And the Amazon's cloud is always moving. Because the real complication isn't just that the river is muddy. It's that the mud doesn't stay put. On the bottom, the Amazon's sediment constantly reshapes itself into forms that look almost like a desert flipped upside down. Sand waves march along the channel bed, some just a few inches high, others the size of small houses, slow-moving dunes built not of dry sand, but of wet grains sliding and rolling under flowing water. Between them, narrow troughs and scours form where faster currents bite into the bed, carving deeper pockets or channels. These aren't geological features that take thousands of years to appear. Many of them move and change over days or weeks. A bed form you carefully mapped during one research trip can be gone, shifted downstream, or buried by the time you return a few months later. The map doesn't stay matched to reality for very long. Imagine trying to survey a town where the streets slowly drift sideways, houses melt into the ground and reappear a block away, and entire neighbourhoods sometimes vanish under new construction overnight. That's essentially what we're dealing with on the Amazon's floor. The streets of the riverbed, its channels, bars and dunes are mobile. For archaeologists, this is especially brutal. Say there once was a canoe landing here 500 years ago, or a small river village 2,000 years ago. Maybe people lost objects in the shallows, a pot, a tool, a carved wooden post, a burial. In a calm lake, those things might settle to the bottom and wait more or less where they fell, slowly covered by sediment, but still traceable. In the Amazon, they are more likely to be swept, tumbled, reburied, exhumed, buried again and finally entombed meters below a new riverbed that didn't even exist when the objects were dropped. A sonar survey today might pass right over a layer of artifacts that sits several yards under the modern channel, invisible beneath dense, shifting sand. A year later, that same layer could be partially eroded away, pieces transported elsewhere, the rest sealed under an even thicker blanket of silt. This is why so many researchers talk about the Amazon as not just a river, but as an engine for erasure. It doesn't just hide things, it actively rewrites where they are. And it isn't only the bottom that moves, the sides move too. The same water that carries sediment along the floor is also chewing into the banks. In many stretches, especially during high water, the current undercuts the packed earth and roots holding the shore together. Panels of riverbank slump and collapse into the channel. Trees tip sideways and vanish trunk first into the water. Whole slices of forest slide away like slow-motion landslides. Downstream, all that newly freed earth becomes raw material for new construction. Sand and silt settle out where the current slows even slightly, on the inside curves of bends, in quiet backwaters, along flooded forests, building fresh sandbars, islands and levees. One village's firm, dry bank can, within a few seasons, become a crumbling edge, while another stretch of forest suddenly finds itself perched atop a newly built natural embankment. For navigation, this means yesterday's safe channel can hide tomorrow's sandbar, and an area that was shallow and harmless last decade might now plunge into a deep scour hole. For anyone trying to catalogue hazards, snags, sunken trees, wrecks, there is no stable list. The hazards keep being created, moved, and buried anew. All of this leads to an important realization about what exploring the Amazon's bottom actually means. In a cave or on the surface of the moon, exploration is often a one-time achievement. You go in, you map the chambers, you plant a flag, you come out with a chart that will be useful, with minor updates for generations. The environment is stable enough that knowledge accumulates faster than the world changes. The Amazon doesn't work like that. Here, the world changes faster than our knowledge can settle. Every measurement you take is stamped with an expiration date. Every map you draw is, by definition, a snapshot of a particular moment in the life of a moving landscape. The sand waves will march on, the banks will fall and rebuild. Features you carefully documented this year may not exist in quite the same form next year, or even next month. So when people imagine truly exploring what lies beneath the Amazon, as if one grand survey could finally reveal the secrets of its floor, they're picturing a kind of achievement this river can't really offer. Not because our tools are useless, or because we lack the will, but because the object of exploration is itself always being rebuilt. To understand what lies beneath the Amazon is less like finishing a map and more like learning to read a story that's still being written, line by line in water and sand. And that restless movement under the surface doesn't just stir the riverbed. It also stirs the water above it, setting up powerful currents and hidden turbulence that create a whole new set of limits on how far we can go. The first thing to understand is how much water is actually moving. When people quote discharge numbers for the Amazon, 200,000 cubic meters per second at the mouth, more than any other river on Earth, those are just sounds and syllables unless you translate them. Think of it as an entire large lake being emptied and refilled every day, not in a gentle pour, but as a continuous roaring conveyor. Each second, more water passes a cross-section of the river than an Olympic swimming pool holds in total, spread out over a wide channel that doesn't always look dramatic from the surface. The boat ride can feel almost calm, but underwater that volume has to get through whatever space the channel offers, and where that space narrows, the water accelerates. In many stretches, especially where the river squeezes between bluffs or over a shallow sill, current speeds of several kilometers per hour are common. In small rapids or near constrictions, local velocities can be far higher. For a human body, or even for heavy equipment, that is not a gentle push. It's a constant sideways drag that never lets go. Divers who work in rivers talk about holding on with 3 hands, 2 on the bottom, and 1 on the line that connects them to the surface. In the Amazon, that joke stops being funny. In fast reaches, you don't simply swim down and mosey around. You fight for every meter you descend, using ropes, anchor points, and sometimes weighted sleds just to approach the riverbed. If you let go, the current will move you, not politely but decisively. And the flow is not uniform. That's where things get complicated, because the bottom is uneven, because sandbanks, submerged logs, and deep pools break up the channel. The water doesn't slide along like a flat sheet of glass. It folds and twists around obstacles. It speeds up here, slows down there, turns over on itself. This is turbulence. Imagine the river not as one current, but as thousands of small currents nested inside each other. Some spiral upward in rising corkscrews, others dive down. Some spin in place as eddies behind sunken tree trunks, or along the inside of a bend. Between these swirling zones are sharp boundaries called shear layers, where fast water rips past slower water. If you were a leaf on the surface, you might only see a few of these patterns, a patch of glassy backwater, a line of foam marking where 2 flows meet. But a diver, or a suspended piece of equipment, feels all of them at once. You might be moving along in a relatively steady push, when you enter a shear zone and the water suddenly grabs your legs and tries to twist you sideways. You brace against the bottom and a small eddy tugs you backward, fighting the main flow. Your guideline, stretched taut upstream, starts to vibrate as different layers of water pluck at it, like a harp string. For a person, that means constant instability. Your body becomes a sail, your arms and legs levers for every swirl of water to work on. You can't just hover calmly over an excavation site the way a diver might over a sunken ship in a still bay. You are being rolled, pitched, pushed up and shoved down, sometimes in all three directions within a few seconds. For instruments, it's even worse. Many of the tools we'd like to use, cameras, sample frames, coring devices, delicate sensors, prefer to be still. They assume a predictable orientation and position. In the Amazon, Turbulence treats them like toys. Lower a camera on a cable and a passing eddy will swing it like a pendulum. Try to hold a sonar transducer at a fixed angle, and the water itself keeps changing that angle for you, microdegrees at a time, blurring your readings. Now add another layer of trouble. The riverbed isn't just uneven, it's full of things that don't show themselves until you're almost on top of them. Submerged trees, entire root balls, collapsed banks, abandoned fishing gear, forgotten cables, natural rock outcrops. All of these can sit just above or protrude slightly from the sediment. In clear water, you'd see them and steer around. In the Amazon's dark, you discover them by touch or by impact. The flow around each obstacle creates its own private turbulence. A jet of faster water along one side, a spinning pocket of reverse flow behind, a curtain of ascending bubbles if gas is seeping from decomposing wood. For navigation, that means no line is straight for long. A guide rope you thought ran cleanly across the bottom might suddenly wrap itself around a stump as the current presses it sideways. A remotely operated vehicle can be sucked into an eddy and gently pinned against a log, invisible to its operators except as a confused cluster of readings. You might think, fine, just anchor yourself, nail the boat in place, pay out a line, and work carefully downstream. The river has opinions about that too. Anchoring in a big, fast river is not like dropping a hook in a quiet harbour. The forces on an anchor line can be enormous. If you drop anchor in softer sediment, the flukes can plough through the sand, tracing long grooves without ever truly biting. If you try to set shallow in coarser material, the anchor might catch abruptly, snapping taut with a jolt that threatens to pull fittings out of the deck. Even when you get a good hold, the boat will still swing in an arc as currents shift, describing a wide, constant circle over the riverbed, instead of staying over a single point. For precision work, taking repeated measurements in exactly the same spot, or hovering over a delicate find, this is poison. The river refuses to let you stay put. Modern vessels can use dynamic positioning systems, computer-controlled thrusters that actively fight the current to keep the boat stationary, relative to the bottom. But those systems were largely designed with the ocean in mind, where currents are powerful but usually more consistent. On a big river where flow can change speed and angle within the length of the ship, dynamic positioning becomes a frantic act of constant correction, engines forever surging and easing to keep up with invisible shifting forces. The same is true for divers and remote vehicles trying to hold station near the bed. The moment you relax your grip on a rock, or you turn your thrusters down to conserve battery, the river begins to move you off target. Over the course of a long survey, these tiny displacements add up. A line of measurements that looks straight on your plan becomes a wandering path in reality, bending gently with each shove of the current. All of this feeds back into a single sobering truth about careful archaeological work under the Amazon. Excavation in the traditional sense relies on control. You mark off a square, you remove sediment layer by layer, you document the precise position of each find relative to a fixed grid. On the Amazon's floor, the grid itself is shaking. The walls of your excavation threaten to collapse as sand liquefies under changing flow. Your tools drift. Your air hoses or power cables tug and snare. Visibility is inches at best, seconds at a time when your lights aren't choked by silt. Long-duration surveys run into a similar wall. To build a detailed image of what lies beneath, you need repeated passes over the same line, at the same height, at the same angle. In open water, that's hard but doable in this river, where every second you are being translated, rotated and lifted by turbulent, sediment-laden water. The idea of same becomes softly theoretical. It isn't that hydrodynamics makes exploration impossible. Researchers do work here. They adapt, they improvise, they accept coarse resolution where they would prefer fine detail. But the power and complexity of the flow sets a ceiling on what can be done gently, slowly, and precisely. And as if fast, opaque, restless water weren't enough of a barrier, it brings with it another, quieter problem. Even when you manage to hold still and point your instruments in the right direction, you still have to deal with what the river does to light itself. Light in the Amazon is a short-lived thing. From the surface, on a bright day, the river can look almost inviting. Brown, yes, but sun-splashed, flecked with reflections, a moving mirror. You might imagine that just below things are dim but still visible as in a murky lake. A little gloomy, perhaps, but manageable with a strong flashlight and a good camera. Drop beneath, and that illusion collapses in a few meters. The reason starts with what the river actually is, chemically and physically. People talk about the Amazon as if it were a single body of water, but in practice it's a meeting place for 3 different kinds of rivers, with very different personalities. There are the whitewater rivers, like the mainstream Amazon itself, for much of its length, born from the Andes. They are overloaded with fine mineral particles, silt, clay, ground rock flour, picked up as the young rivers chew their way through rising mountains. These particles are tiny, light and stubborn. They don't settle quickly. They stay suspended, turning the water the colour of milky coffee. Then there are the blackwater rivers, like the Rio Negro. These flow more gently over lowland forests and sandy soils, carrying little mineral sediment, but a heavy load of dissolved organic matter, tannins and other compounds, leached from decaying leaves and wood. It's the same chemistry that gives strong tea its colour. In high concentration, it turns water into something that looks almost like weak cola from the surface, and nearly ink black when you're inside it. Finally, there are clear water rivers, such as the Tapajos and Xingu, which run over older, more resistant rocks and scrubby savannas, picking up fewer particles and fewer tannins. They can actually be quite transparent in places, at least by Amazon standards, with a greenish or bluish tint. In theory, you might think, wonderful. Just work in the clear water sections and avoid the rest. In practice, these 3 water types mix, braid, and overlay each other across vast distances. A single stretch of river may have a black water plume hugging one bank, white water streaking down the centre, and clearer water offshore, each slowly blending but never entirely disappearing. And even the clearest channel is still full of microscopic life, stray sediment and floating debris. For light, each of these waters is hostile in a different way. In black water, the dissolved tannins soak up light the way a dark curtain does. Blue and green wavelengths vanish quickly, even in shallow depths. Reds and yellows fade into a uniform brownish gloom. The water doesn't just block your view, it eats the light itself. A diver's lamp produces a bright halo around the bulb, and then, only a metre or 2 away, the beam is gone, as if the darkness is thick enough to swallow it. In whitewater, the problem is not absorption, but scattering. Millions of tiny mineral grains hang in the water column, each one a little mirror and prism. When a ray of light hits them, it bounces in random directions. Some of it still reaches your eyes or your camera, but much of it is thrown right back toward the source. This is backscatter. If you've ever tried to take a photograph in a dusty room with the flash on, you've seen backscatter. The picture fills with bright, blurry dots, and the subject fades into fog in the background. Under the Amazon, the entire water volume is that dusty room. Turn on a powerful light, and you aren't illuminating the scene beyond, you are lighting up the dust between you and it. Clear water behaves better, but not for long. As soon as you stir the bottom with a fin or a propeller nicks the sediment, you create your own private whitewater cloud. Sand and silt billow upward, fine enough to remain suspended for minutes, sometimes hours. The visibility that looked promising on entry begins to shrink. 2 meters, 1 meter, a few hand spans. In places, a diver can see the pressure gauge on their wrist, but not their other hand. This is why simply adding more light does not solve the problem. Intense lamps, high-powered strobes, LED arrays, they all meet the same fate. The brighter the beam, the more violently it reveals every particle in its path. To a camera, this looks like a wall of glowing noise. Edges blur, contrast collapses. A smooth piece of wood can be mistaken for a rock ledge, a ripple in the sand for an artifact, a shadowed hollow for a deep crevasse. Even when you manage to capture usable footage, it comes with hidden traps. Colour information is distorted, especially in tannin-rich water, where everything tends toward the same dark palette. Textures that would help identify, say, worked stone versus naturally fractured rock are softened by scattering. Small features, carvings, tool marks, inscriptions are the first to vanish into the haze. On review, researchers might argue over whether a faint line in an image is a natural crack, a plant root, or a human mark. The river itself has blurred the testimony. Worse, the camera's perspective can be deceptive. With visibility reduced to an arm's length, you seldom see entire objects. You see fragments, a curve here, a flat surface there. In clear seawater, you might swim around an object, examine it from multiple angles, reconstruct its shape in your mind. In the Amazon, each new angle requires fighting the current, stirring more sediment, further shortening the range of vision. Often you accept a single imperfect view and move on, because staying makes things worse, not better. All of this slows exploration to a crawl. A survey that might cover hundreds of meters in open coastal water shrinks to tens of meters here. Divers move by feel, hands sliding along the bottom, counting seconds and kicks. Remotely operated vehicles use sonar and tilt sensors to guess where they are relative to the bed, advancing cautiously in short bursts, because the cameras that should guide them show little more than brown fog with a few ghostly outlines. Errors multiply. A mound of compacted roots half buried in silt can be logged as a possible structure. A natural scour hollow might be mistaken for a dug pit. The next team that comes to check may not even be able to find the same spot, let alone the same feature, because the sediment has shifted, and the visibility on that day is even worse. Faced with this, river explorers quietly demote sight from its usual throne. They rely on touch, the feel of grain size under gloved fingers, the sudden give of soft organic peat versus the firmness of clay, the way a shaped edge interrupts the smooth curve of a cobble. They trust sound, sonar pings painting outlines, where cameras see only murk, echo patterns hinting at buried logs, boulders, or voids. And above all, they lean on inference, repeated instrument readings, indirect measurements, and careful comparison with what is known from drier places along the banks. The Amazon is not blind exactly. It is a place where light is a poor language and vision a clumsy translator. To learn what lies beneath, you have to listen, feel, and calculate more than you look. But even if you give up on your eyes, there is another boundary waiting. The simple fact that water is heavy, and that the deeper you go into this darkness, the more it presses back. Water may seem soft from above, but to a body underneath it is weight. Every 10 meters you descend, the pressure increases by about 1 atmosphere. Your lungs, your sinuses, every gas space inside you feels that squeeze. In the open ocean, where visibility can be tens of meters, divers accept this as part of the job. You see where you're going, you know your depth, you can plan your time. In the Amazon, the same physics plays out in a place where you often can't see your own hand. The river is not uniformly shallow. People imagine a broad, ankle-deep sheet of water sliding lazily across the continent. In reality, it is cut by deep channels, scour holes, and sudden drop-offs carved by currents you cannot see. Some stretches are only a few meters deep at low water. Others plunge to 30, 40, even more, especially in the main stem and at confluences where one giant river meets another. These depths are not rare curiosities. They are woven into the ordinary architecture of the channel, hidden beneath a flat, unbroken surface. You can be drifting along over 6 meters of water, toes pointed toward the bottom, and then, within a few body lengths, the floor falls away into a dark void 2 or 3 times as deep. To a diver, that means an instant change, not just in distance to the bottom, but in the pressure squeezing their body and the decompression cost of every extra minute spent below. And the river does not stay still while you adjust. Current accelerates down into those deeper slots, like wind funneling through a mountain pass. The water that seemed gentle on the surface reveals its true momentum, where it has room to stretch out. It folds around submerged boulders, snags on dead trees, spins off vortices that can push or pull a human body sideways with surprising force. In this environment, entanglement stops being an abstract worry and becomes a constant threat. The Amazon is full of things that catch. Fishing lines and nets, laid by communities up and down the banks. Roots and branches projecting from drowned forests, stripped of leaves but still intricately branched. Old cables from ferry crossings, discarded traps, even natural vines carried downstream and hung up on submerged snags. In clear water you see these hazards coming. You root around them. In 1 meter visibility, they announce themselves only when they brush your mask, snag your hose, or wrap around your fin. A single loop of line across a regulator hose can turn a straightforward ascent into a blind, panicked struggle to get free before your air runs low. Disorientation adds another layer. In the sea, divers use the play of light from above, the colour of the water, the shape of the bottom. Here, the light is gone. The bottom is a featureless field of soft sediment, and the current is not a steady breeze, but a shifting, layered force. You can be kneeling on the riverbed, carefully feeling along a patch of clay, and then a surge comes through, lifts you, rotates you a quarter turn and sets you down again a few meters away. When you look up, everything is the same colour of brown. Up and downstream are no longer obvious. Your bubbles spread and flatten in the turbulence, giving you no clean vertical line to follow. This matters because of decompression. Human bodies can only tolerate so much dissolved gas in their tissues. Stay too long at depth or come up too quickly, and nitrogen, which has quietly seeped into your blood under pressure, forms bubbles. In mild cases it is painful. In severe cases it can paralyze or kill. To avoid this, divers follow strict limits. So many minutes at a given depth before you must begin ascent, often with pauses at shallower levels to let gases leave the body safely. These are bottom time budgets. In deeper parts of the Amazon's channels, they get very tight very quickly. You can't simply decide to spend an hour on the bottom, feeling around for artifacts. At 30 meters, that's a fantasy, unless you're using specialized gas mixtures and long decompression stops. under a busy shipping lane in cold, opaque water full of debris. Those stops are not just tedious, they are dangerous loitering. And surface support is not sitting a few meters away in a calm harbour. Many of the most interesting stretches of the river are remote. The nearest town can be hours away by boat. Helicopter access may be limited or impossible at night or in poor weather. There is no chamber nearby to treat a serious decompression injury. Communication may be a scratchy radio that works only intermittently under a heavy canopy. If something goes wrong at depth, a blown hose, an entanglement that costs precious minutes, a sudden current that pushes you deeper than planned, your margin is thin. You may surface with symptoms of the bends and no realistic way to get advanced treatment in time. Or you may not surface at all. Rescue is also complicated by the river itself. A diver who fails to come up on schedule in clear coastal water can often be traced along a likely path, following bubbles or using search patterns with good visibility. In the Amazon, the current can move a body horizontally, vertically and into underwater structures, root tangles, log jams, undercut banks that are effectively labyrinths. Sending in more divers multiplies the risk without any guarantee of success. For scientific teams, this changes the calculation. The question stops being, can someone physically go down there, and becomes, is a brief, dangerous human visit actually better than what we can do with instruments? Most of the time the answer is no. You can attach sensors to weighted frames, lower them carefully, and retrieve them without exposing a person to the full hazard. You can send small remotely operated vehicles that shrug off entangling lines by sacrificing a propeller, not a life. You can map the shape of the bottom with sound from a boat, hour after hour, without worrying about decompression schedules or emergency evacuation. These methods are imperfect. They blur detail, miss small objects, and sometimes misread what they encounter. But they can work steadily, patiently, over long stretches of river that would simply be off-limits to divers. In that sense, the Amazon enforces a kind of humility. It allows short, highly controlled human incursions below the surface, in carefully chosen spots with backup and planning and luck. But as a general rule, it refuses to be explored the way a coral reef might be, by curious people swimming through its spaces, seeing and touching things directly. Instead, we are left to listen to echoes, to study graphs, to interpret faint hints from tools that can endure conditions our bodies cannot. And even when we accept those limits, there is another kind of life in the water that must be considered, not just for our safety, but for its own. The Amazon is not just water moving over sand, it is water thick with life. In every cubic metre, there are living things. Not just the famous ones, the pink river dolphins and the giant catfish, but layers upon layers of smaller creatures. Plankton, insect larvae, snails, tiny crustaceans. Fish species that have never been formally described, drifting among roots and leaves. Sponges and freshwater corals clinging to harder patches of bottom. Algae films on every surface that light can reach, and bacterial mats where it cannot. To a scientist, this is wonder. To equipment, it is friction. Anything you put into the river begins to be claimed. Ropes grow slick with biofilm that turns to a black, rubbery coat. Metal frames that go down bright come back up the colour of old tea, furred with slime, seedlings and the first exploratory shells of barnacle-like animals. Camera housings acquire a haze of life that scatters what little light makes it through the water. Propellers pick up weedy growths that unbalance them and shorten their lives. This process is called biofouling, and in a place like the Amazon, it is not a slow background issue. It is rapid and aggressive. A sensor left overnight may already be compromised. A cable laid for a week can become a living vine, heavier, more brittle, more likely to snag. Over months, whole installations disappear under a shag carpet of organisms until they are more reef than machine. Dense biodiversity also means the bottom is not a clean, hard surface waiting to be mapped. Roots knit the sediment into complex three-dimensional structures. Fallen trunks host communities of invertebrates and fish that chew and burrow, hollowing them out into fragile tunnels. Stingrays bury themselves in the top few centimetres of sand, invisible until disturbed. Electric fish patrol territories, using pulses of current as both language and radar. When an ROV's tether slides along this crowded landscape, it does not just catch on dead wood. It brushes living colonies, disturbs feeding grounds, collapses burrows. A metal sled dragged to sample sediment can shear off whole gardens of rare plants and sponges in a few careless meters. Even a diver's fin kick can strip the protective mucus from delicate fish eggs or crush unseen nests. Some of the life in the river can hurt us. Some of it only seems like it can. People picture the Amazon as a place where everything wants to bite, sting, or poison them. There are real dangers, electric eels capable of delivering strong shocks, rays with venomous barbs in their tails, piranhas that, under the right conditions, will test anything that splashes as possible food, kangaroo catfish that seek out tight, water-flowing spaces, large caimans and the occasional lurking anaconda. But most of these animals are not patrolling the depths looking for divers to attack. They are going about their own lives, reacting to disturbance in ways that are usually predictable and avoidable given local knowledge. Nevertheless, when you plan operations, you cannot assume probably fine. You have to assume worst reasonable case. Electric shocks underwater complicate both human safety and electronics. A startled ray kicking up from the bottom can turn a gentle research dive into an emergency if the barb finds a poorly protected limb. Schooling fish attracted to lights and sounds can swarm a camera or ROV, clogging its view and ramming its sensors. Even harmless species can become hazards when they are dense enough to obscure cables, tilt instruments, or distract people at critical moments. Risk planning in the Amazon is shaped as much by what people believe as by what is statistically likely. Many expedition leaders will cancel a dive if local fishers say the piranhas in a particular backwater are angry that season, even if formal data are thin. Stories of kangaroo incidents, whether rare or embellished, influence decisions about where and how people enter the water. Long memories of encounters with caimans or snakes around certain log jams lead to those places being mapped as no-go, not because the hazard is constant, but because the cost of being wrong is too high. There is also disease. Warm, nutrient-rich water is an ideal medium for parasites and pathogens. Small cuts can become serious infections. Certain snails host flukes that cause chronic illness. Some stretches suffer blooms of cyanobacteria that release toxins. For divers and technicians, this means vaccinations, prophylactic medicines, and strict rules about exposure. It also means recognizing that every extra minute in the water, every unnecessary splash, is another roll of biological dice. Wrapped around all of this is a different kind of constraint: ethics. In the past, when explorers wanted to know what lived in a river, they sometimes used methods that today would be considered unacceptable. Dynamite to stun fish, poisons that suffocated everything in a pool for the sake of an inventory, heavy trawls that scraped the bottom clean. In the Amazon, those approaches would be especially disastrous. Many species here are endemic to particular tributaries or floodplain lakes. Some are known from only a handful of specimens. Whole evolutionary stories may hang on a few fragile populations tucked into side channels or undercut banks. The idea of scouring those places with destructive gear, simply to satisfy curiosity about what lies beneath, runs directly against modern conservation ethics. Today, Most scientific work on the river falls under strict rules. National legislation in countries like Brazil, Peru, and Colombia regulates what can be collected, how many individuals of a given species may be taken, and where. Exporting biological samples requires permits. Working inside protected areas, national parks, biological reserves, sustainable use forests demands additional layers of approval and oversight. This is not just bureaucracy. It is a recognition that the Amazon's living systems are already under pressure from deforestation, climate change, overfishing, and pollution. Researchers are expected to minimize their footprint, to take only as much as is necessary, and to design studies that do not further degrade habitats that may already be near breaking points. Indigenous territories add another, deeper level of responsibility. Large stretches of the river and its tributaries run through lands recognized as belonging to indigenous peoples, or through areas claimed and used by communities whose presence predates modern nation-states. These are not empty spaces awaiting exploration. They are home. For those communities, the river is not just a research subject. It is a relative, a source of food, a route of travel, a spiritual being. Certain pools, bends, or confluences may be considered sacred or dangerous in ways that are understood through stories rather than spreadsheets. Access is not simply a matter of showing government permits. It requires consultation, consent, and often a willingness to accept no as the final answer. Even when permission is granted, there may be conditions. No night operations near fishing grounds, no loud motors in breeding seasons, no invasive sampling in areas used for drinking water or ritual bathing. Scientists may be asked to share findings in accessible forms, to involve local people as partners rather than as sources of labour, and to respect taboos that do not map neatly onto Western notions of risk. All of this means that the ecology of the Amazon adds not just danger but obligation. Every cable laid across the bottom has to be weighed against the animals it will cross and the people who rely on them. Every instrument lowered into a deep channel has to justify the disturbance it will cause. Even the decision to send a diver down is no longer only about whether it is safe for that individual. It is about what their presence will do to the community of life they enter, often unseen. So when we say we cannot truly explore what lies beneath the Amazon River, we are not only talking about mud, darkness and pressure. We are talking about a living web so dense that any attempt to move through it risks breaking strands we do not yet understand. And above this living river, the sky itself conspires to reshape everything, again and again, in a slow, pulsing rhythm that further blurs the line between water, land, and the hidden world in between. The Amazon does not have 4 seasons, it has a pulse. Each year, as rains build over the Andes and across the basin, the river begins to swell. Not with a single storm, not with one dramatic flood, but with months of accumulated water. Tributaries thicken. Small streams that were a careful step across in the dry season become brown, rushing corridors. The main stem rises metre by metre quietly at first, then with a kind of slow inevitability. On paper, the Amazon's average discharge is a number. In reality, it is a moving heartbeat. By the time the flood peak arrives, the river is no longer just a channel. It is a moving sheet of water that has climbed out of its banks and gone walking across the forest. Places that were dry ground in August sit under several metres of water in May. Forests become what scientists call várzea and igapo, flooded forests, where tree trunks emerge straight from tea-coloured depths. The boundary between river and land dissolves. Fish drift among branches, dolphins surface where, a few months earlier, people were cooking over fires. Trails turn into canoe routes, backyards become bays. From orbit you can see the difference. the narrow, sinuous thread of the low-water Amazon is replaced by a vast, spreading stain. Dozens of new lakes appear, channels braid and rebraid. The river is no longer a line, it is an area. For anything trying to understand the bottom, this is where the trouble truly begins. Floodwaters are not just deeper copies of the dry season river. They are machines for moving earth. As the water rises, it gains access to new slopes, new banks, new soils. It undercuts fresh patches of clay, gnaws at recently formed sandbars and pries loose whole rafts of vegetation. Old riverbanks slump into the flow. Trees topple, dragging root balls full of sediment. Leaf litter that sat quietly on the forest floor for months is suddenly afloat, breaking down, feeding microbial blooms. Suspended in this churning mix are grains of every size, from fine clays that ride the current like smoke, to coarse sands that bounce and skip along the bed. In some reaches, whole dunes of sand march slowly downstream under the force of the flood, their crests slipping, reforming, then slipping again. In others, the water scours, digging temporary holes where it accelerates around bends or through constrictions, only to fill them in again when the current slackens. Any mark on the bottom, a channel carved last year, a clean scour hole under a fallen log, even the subtle ripples left by a previous high flow, is vulnerable. The new flood rearranges them as casually as a hand smoothing patterns in a sandbox. If you drop an instrument in March and map a cross-section of the river, you will capture one version of reality. Return in September, after the peak and the retreat, and that reality may be gone. A ridge of sand has migrated 10 meters sideways. A deep hole now holds a plug of compacted mud. A side channel that seemed permanent has pinched off at its upper end, leaving a crescent-shaped lake behind. For expedition planners, the flood pulse turns time into as much of a constraint as space. There are windows when conditions for exploration are, if not ideal, at least less punishing. At low water, currents may be gentler in some stretches, making it easier to hold a survey line, to keep an ROV from being torn away, to anchor a boat without dragging. Visibility, while still poor, can sometimes improve slightly as total suspended material drops in certain tributaries. Banks are exposed, giving clearer reference points and more places to land equipment. But low water also means shallows that suddenly become impassable, sandbars that trap boats, and isolated pools where fish are concentrated and stress levels, including those of piranhas, may be higher. It is never simple. At high water you can reach places that are otherwise cut off, back channels, flooded forests, remote communities only accessible by canoe. Yet the same depth that opens new paths also buries the bottom under extra meters of fast, swirling flow. Anchors drag. Cables bow out in the current. Anything tethered wants to rise and spin. Between these extremes lies a brief, shifting period when the river is neither at its hungriest nor its laziest. Local researchers know these weeks by feel too early, and half the planned sites are still dry land. Too late, and the pulse has taken hold, turning every operation into a race against rising water. Good conditions are not a season. They are a moving target that slides forward or backward each year, depending on rainfall patterns thousands of kilometers away. Complicating everything is the simple question, where exactly is the river? In a textbook, the Amazon is drawn as a main channel with branching tributaries. In reality, much of its length is bordered by a belt of floodplain, an intricate lace of oxbow lakes, cut-off meanders, side channels, seasonal lagoons and flooded forests. Some of these water bodies connect directly to the main flow during high water and then isolate as the river drops, trapping fish, sediments, and sometimes entire stories of past floods in their quiet depths. is a floodplain lake that spends 4 months a year exchanging water with the main stem part of the riverbed you're trying to explore? What about an abandoned channel, now a swamp, that still hints at a buried connection in sub-bottom layers? Even defining the object of study becomes slippery when the map itself is rewritten every year. For scientists, engineers and historians trying to piece together what lies beneath, this seasonal rewriting has a clear implication. One visit is never enough. To understand how the bottom truly behaves, you need repeated measurements across multiple stages of the flood pulse, low rising, peak falling, and across many years. Only then do patterns begin to emerge from the noise. Only then can you distinguish a permanent deep channel from a temporary scour hole, a stable sandbar from a migrating dune field, a long-lived undercut bank from a brief bite taken by a particularly strong flood. Long-term monitoring is expensive and logistically difficult. Instruments must survive not just mud and biofouling, but months of being alternately buried, exposed and battered by shifting currents. Data series are interrupted by broken cables, lost anchors, sudden storms, changes in funding. Yet without those sustained efforts, our picture of the Amazon's hidden floor remains a stack of snapshots from different years and different moods, rather than a continuous film. And while we stitch those fragments together, the river keeps pulsing, rising, spilling into the forest, then retreating, leaving behind a rearranged landscape and a new set of questions about what exactly lies below the surface we only ever see for a moment before it changes again. When people think of mapping the bottom, they often imagine something like an underwater MRI. You send out a pulse, the machine hums and a crisp picture of the riverbed appears on a screen. In a way that isn't completely wrong. But in the Amazon, it's also deeply misleading. The main tool for sounding out the depths is sonar, literally, sound navigation and ranging. The basic idea is simple enough to explain to a child. You make a sound, it travels through the water, hits the bottom and bounces back. You measure how long the echo takes to return. Because the speed of sound in water is roughly known, you can turn that travel time into a distance. Do this once and you know how deep it is right under your boat. Do this thousands of times as you move and you can sketch a crude profile of the bed. Modern multi-beam sonar takes this old echo-sounding trick and turns it into a fan. Instead of one narrow beam pointing straight down, it sends out dozens, sometimes hundreds, of beams at slightly different angles. Each beam listens for its own echo. The result is not a single depth reading, but a whole swath of the riverbed captured in one pass. Stitch those swaths together and you get a bathymetric map. Ridges of sand, scoop-shaped scour holes, abrupt drops, gentle shoals. The invisible floor becomes a landscape in deep quiet lakes or on open continental shelves. This works beautifully. The maps can be so precise that you see individual boulders, the faint outlines of old shipwrecks, even the rippled patterns of sand dunes marching across the bottom. The Amazon is not a deep, quiet lake. Here, the same sound waves that draw clean pictures in calm water are thrown into confusion. The river is full of noise, not just the humming of engines and the ping of other instruments, but physical noise in the water itself. Turbulence breaks the flow into swirling eddies, pockets of faster and slower water, zones of slightly different temperature, and suspended sediment. Each of these can bend, scatter, or muffle the sound. On the screen, this shows up as fuzz, speckle, ghost shapes that may or may not correspond to anything solid. A beam aimed toward what should be the bottom might first pass through a dense tongue of muddy water, giving the illusion of a shallower depth. Another beam, just a few degrees away, might find a clearer path and return from much deeper. The instrument dutifully records both. The river offers no footnote explaining why. Shallow zones pose their own problems. Multibeam systems need a certain amount of depth just to spread their fan of beams. In water that is only a few meters deep, the footprint shrinks, coverage narrows, and the angle at which the sound hits the bed becomes trickier. The very places that are most dynamic, sandbars, shifting shoals, braided shallows, are often the least well imaged. In some reaches, the boat simply cannot go where the questions are most interesting. Then there is the softness of the bottom itself. Sonar is good at bouncing off hard surfaces, rock ledges, compacted clay, metal, but a thick layer of soft mud or loose sand behaves differently. The sound can penetrate slightly into it before reflecting. Some frequencies sink in more, others less. The returning echo may not come from a sharp boundary, but from a fuzzy zone where water gradually turns into sediment. On a depth profile, this can look like a gently sloping floor when, in fact, there is a thin skin of loose material over a much sharper drop. In other places, the system might latch onto the top of a migrating sand dune and ignore the valley just behind it. The bottom you see depends on how you define the moment when water stops and earth begins, and in the Amazon that line is often a gradient, not a step. All of this makes calibration both vital and surprisingly fragile. Before trusting their maps, survey teams have to tell the instrument how sound is actually moving through the water on that particular day, in that particular stretch of river. They lower probes to measure temperature, sometimes salinity, sometimes sediment concentration. They adjust the assumed speed of sound accordingly. They might run over a known feature, a submerged pier, a rock shelf, a previous benchmark, to check whether the depths match what they expect. But the Amazon does not sit still while they do this. A rainstorm upstream, a shift in the flood pulse, even the daily heating and cooling of the surface layers can change the structure of the water column over hours. The calibration that was valid in the morning may be slightly off by afternoon. Currents push the boat sideways, altering the angle of the beams. The same cross-section run on 2 different days, or even 2 different passes on the same day, can produce subtly different maps. In quiet offices far from the river, these inconsistencies might look like mere technical noise. Up close, they are reminders that the instrument is listening to a moving target through a medium that will not behave. Then comes the hardest part, interpretation. Even when the raw data are good, turning echoes into meaning is an art that leans on experience, comparison, and sometimes guesswork. A strong, crisp reflection might indicate a rock outcrop, a compacted clay bank, or the buried hull of a barge. A weaker, more diffuse return could be soft sediment, but it might also be a tangle of drowned tree trunks, or an accumulation of sunken leaves and branches held a meter or 2 above the true bed. On sonar images, large logs can masquerade as small ridges. A fallen tree angled across the flow may throw a shadow in the data that looks like a sudden step in the riverbed. Compacted sand can reflect like stone in some floodplain lakes. Layers of older, denser mud lie beneath a fresh veneer of lighter material. The instrument records a blend of these layers. The analyst has to decide which surface matters for navigation, which for erosion studies, which for the slow archaeology of the river's past. In clear oceans, surveyors can often verify their interpretations with cameras or divers. In the Amazon, where visibility collapses to arm's length and current fights every attempt to hold still. Such checks are rare and local. Most of the time, the echo is all you have. So sonar and multibeam systems give us something precious: structure, depth, a sense of shape in the dark. They turn an unknowable void into a landscape of ridges and hollows, banks and pools. But they are not truth machines. They are tools that translate sound into images under conditions that are almost designed to confuse them. What we end up with is not a final definitive portrait of the riverbed, but a working sketch, powerful enough to guide ships and to frame scientific questions, yet full of blind spots, uncertainties, and places where the picture smears into guesswork. To fill in those gaps, explorers have tried another vantage point altogether, not from within the water, but from high above it, looking down through clouds and canopy at a river whose true floor still lies several layers out of reach. From orbit, the Amazon looks almost simple, a pale, twisting band of water, sometimes milk coffee brown, sometimes a darker tea, winding through an endless carpet of green. From this height, the river finally seems tame enough to measure. No mosquitoes, no heat, no roaring current, just pixels. And in some ways, satellites really are the Amazon's best behaved witnesses. They are excellent at watching the surface. They can track the changing width of the main channel, the moment when a narrow dry season thread suddenly swells into a broad floodplain sea. They see where the water spills over its banks, filling side channels and floodplain lakes like ink spreading across thin paper. They follow colour. That brown is not just one brown. Subtle shifts reveal changing sediment loads, the mixing of whitewater rivers rich in Andean silt, with darker blackwater streams stained by decaying leaves. Over weeks and months, those swirls and plumes tell stories about erosion upstream, about landslides and storms, about dams built and forests cleared. Satellites are also patient. They visit again and again, pass after pass, year after year. Stack their images together, and you can watch the river breathe. Meanders creep sideways, cut-off bends turn into oxbow lakes, sandbars appear, grow and vanish. Entire reaches of the channel slowly migrate across the landscape. From space, what feels like a fixed river on human timescales begins to reveal its restlessness. Some systems go further, tracking the tiny changes in surface height that, averaged over wide areas, hint at how much water is stored in the channel and floodplain. Others measure how rough or smooth the water surface looks under certain conditions, letting researchers infer patterns of flow, eddies, and zones of stronger or weaker current. If all you needed to know about the Amazon were its outline on a map and its seasonal moods, satellites would be a nearly perfect solution. But they are, almost by definition, blind to what lies beneath. Most satellite instruments operate in parts of the spectrum that water absorbs very well. Visible light doesn't make it far below the surface, especially not in sediment-choked channels. Infrared is swallowed even faster. What the sensors really see is a thin skin, the top few millimeters reflecting sunlight back toward orbit. Beneath that, the river may be 10 meters deep, or 50, or hiding a submerged ridge. To the satellite, those places look nearly identical. Radar promises something more. Instead of waiting for sunlight, radar satellites send out their own pulses of microwave energy and listen for the echoes. Certain radar bands can slip past clouds that would block optical cameras. Some can sense subtle changes in the height of land and water surfaces, even beneath light vegetation. In a region where rainy skies and thick canopy are the norm, this is a powerful gift. Synthetic aperture radar can pick out the boundaries between flooded and unflooded forest, even when the treetops look uniform. It can show where floodwaters have spread far beyond the visible channel, creeping into back swamps and along forgotten paleochannels. It can measure how those flooded areas expand and contract, map the veins and capillaries of the river system that never show as open water in a simple photograph. But radar, too, meets its limit at the water's surface. The wavelengths that are strong enough to shrug off clouds and canopy are far too coarse to penetrate deep into liquid water and return anything like a crisp map of the bed. They tell you that water is present, how rough its surface is, how it spreads and retreats. They do not show you the drowned log, the steep scarp, the buried terrace. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, seems at first glance like the magical exception. In other parts of the world, airborne LiDAR has stripped away forests digitally, revealing lost cities, hidden causeways, ancient terraces. Over parts of the Amazon basin, similar surveys have traced geometric earthworks on the uplands, the faint raised outlines of prehistoric fields, the ghosts of long abandoned settlements. LiDAR works by firing rapid pulses of laser light toward the ground and timing how long they take to bounce back. Some pulses hit leaves and branches, others slip through small gaps to strike the soil. Combine millions of these returns and you can peel back the canopy, constructing an extraordinarily detailed model of the land surface. Yet water changes the rules. The wavelengths used in most terrestrial LiDAR systems are reflected or absorbed almost entirely at the surface. A few specialized bathymetric systems using green light can probe shallow, clear water in coastal zones and mountain streams. But the Amazon's main channels are not clear pools. They are liquid earth, suspended sediment, and dissolved organic matter scatter and swallow the light within centimeters. To a laser pulse, the river is a bright mirror and then nothing. So from above we become very good at one kind of knowing and remain almost ignorant of another. We can draw the river's outline as it swells and shrinks. We can chart where floodwaters invade the forest and how long they linger. We can map the dry land around it with exquisite precision, teasing out ancient ditches and causeways, speculating about past societies along the banks. But the actual three-dimensional shape of the channel floor, its ledges and hollows, its undercut banks and buried scars, stays largely in the domain of sonar and local measurement. Above and below live in different data worlds. This is where a familiar claim begins to fray. It is common to hear that we've mapped the Amazon as if the existence of satellite imagery and digital elevation models meant the work was done. In reality, much of what has been mapped so far is the river's moving skin and the solid ground beside it. The true bottom, especially its deeper layers and older forms, remain stitched together from sparse soundings, scattered surveys, and careful guesswork. The sky can tell us how the surface dances. It cannot, on its own, reveal the hidden architecture beneath that dance. To glimpse that, you have to listen not just for echoes from the present bed, but for the fainter reflections of older channels, buried valleys, and sediments laid down when the river flowed in different paths entirely. So researchers turn to tools that don't just glance off the present bottom, but try to peer into it. One of these is called sub-bottom profiling. Instead of light, it uses sound, low-frequency pulses that can pass not only through water, but a short distance into the mud and sand beneath. A boat moves along the river, sending down these muffled thumps. Some of the sound bounces off the water-sediment boundary, like ordinary sonar. But some energy keeps going, penetrating layer after layer until changes in density between fine mud and coarser sand, between sediment and buried wood, between one packed layer and the next, send faint echoes back. Stack those echoes along the path of the boat, and you get something like an ultrasound of the riverbed. Not a sharp photograph, more a hazy cross-section where the present channel bottom is only the top line, and beneath it lie ghostly arcs and bands, old bars filled in scour holes, ledges from a time when the river was in a different mood or a different place. Another method is even more direct, and somehow more intimate. Sediment coring. A long tube, metal, plastic, sometimes with a cutting edge at the tip, is driven down into the bed. It can go a metre, a few metres, in some places tens of metres, pushing past soft mud into compacted older layers. Then it's brought back up like a needle threaded with time. Inside, the layers are stacked: coarse sand, then finer silt, then a smear of dark organic-rich ooze. Maybe a thin band of clay, then sand again. Tiny shells, bits of charcoal, pollen grains from forests long gone to other shores of the channel. Each centimetre is a moment when the river paused long enough to leave something behind. Taken together, sub-bottom profiles and cores let scientists do something we cannot do with our eyes: reconstruct at least fragments of the Amazon's buried past. They reveal paleochannels, ancient river courses now filled with younger sediment. In the sub-bottom data, these might appear as graceful U-shapes cut deep into older strata, the typical signature of a meandering bend that once swung far to one side. Today, the surface channel may be hundreds of meters away, flowing in a completely different line. The old loop is invisible from above, smoothed over by floodplain. Only the sound waves notice the buried scar. Over centuries and millennia, a big river like the Amazon doesn't simply deepen the same groove. It migrates. One bank erodes while the other side quietly builds up new deposits. Bends tighten, then cut off, leaving oxbow lakes that may later silt up and become meadows. Then forests, then just a subtle depression. Entire reaches of channel slowly walk across the valley, leaving behind stacked sets of abandoned paths, each one backfilled with sand and mud. In some parts of the basin, longer-term climate shifts and changes in Andean uplift have pushed the river system into entirely new arrangements. Channels that once carried a major share of the flow may now be minor tributaries or dry relief in the sub-bottom record, overlain by younger floodplain. On paper, this sounds orderly, a neat geologic archive where each layer tells a clear story. In reality, the Amazon's underworld is noisy. Buried logs and tree trunks, saturated with water and entombed in mud, can show up in sub-bottom data as sharp reflectors, bright lines or blobs that interrupt the smooth layering. To the instrument, dense wood can look like rock or like a strange pocket of compact sediment. A tangle of flood-killed forest preserved inside the bed might masquerade as a mysterious hard layer until someone cores it and finds cellulose instead of stone. Old sandbars are another source of confusion. Sand is porous and often has very similar acoustic properties, whether it was laid down last year or 1,000 years ago. Stacked bar deposits, young on top of older still, can blur into one bright band with few internal markers. Distinguishing a bar formed during a 20th century flood from one shaped under a different climate regime becomes tricky. The river reuses its own building materials. Then there are older deposits that predate the modern channel entirely. Ancient floodplains, lake beds, even remnants of times when this region drained in other directions. In the subsurface, these can look like flat, massive units or subtle inclined beds. But when the active channel slices into them and then moves away again, it strips pieces out, leaves others dangling. The resulting patchwork means that a core taken here and another taken a kilometre away might tell apparently different histories, simply because erosion has edited the archive unevenly. This is why the idea of the river as an archive needs a careful qualifier. It is not a neatly bound series of volumes filed in perfect sequence. It is more like a library that has been flooded, rearranged, partially burned, and then used as the foundation for a new building. Some records are beautifully preserved. Fine laminations of silt and clay may capture annual flood cycles, even individual flood events like tree rings in mud. Pollen trapped in those layers can whisper of vanished forests. Bits of charcoal can hint at fires, natural or human set, on distant slopes. Other records are obliterated. A single high-energy flood, a channel avulsion, a major cutbank collapse can scour tens of meters of previous deposits from one place and redeposit them, shredded and mixed somewhere else. Entire centuries can be planned away, leaving a gap no instrument can fill. And some records are preserved, but far from where they began. A landslide in the Andes collapses a hillside forest into a tributary. Over years and decades, wood fragments and mineral grains move downstream, are buried, exhumed, buried again. By the time they settle for good in a mid-basin floodplain, their original context is gone. Their story is still there, but it has been translated, abridged, scattered. So when scientists lower instruments and retrieve cores, they are reading a complicated palimpsest. They can see that the Amazon has shifted courses many times, that its power to erase is matched by its habit of forgetting and misfiling its own past. What they still cannot fully answer is crucial. Which episodes of the river's history have been carefully tucked away in stable floodplain pockets, protected from later scouring? Which have been ground down and washed to the Atlantic, their details forever lost? How many ancient channels lie hidden under today's forests, with their stories of earlier climates, earlier ecologies, perhaps earlier human presences moved, scrambled, or erased? Those are the sub-bottom secrets, the half-legible sentences written in sand and clay beneath the flowing water. To approach the Amazon's deeper history, you have to accept that you are working with fragments, beautiful, suggestive, but incomplete. And while the river hides its oldest paths in this shifting underworld, it is also busy rearranging everything humans leave in its shallower layers, making another kind of investigation into ships, wrecks, and the river's human memory just as uncertain. When we think about underwater archaeology, we often picture shipwrecks like time capsules. A hull on the seafloor, cargo still in its hold, plates and bottles and tools lying more or less where they fell. Divers map the site, take careful photos, recover a few key objects. The wreck is a scene, a moment of history frozen in place. The Amazon is not interested in freezing anything. Here, a wreck is not a scene so much as an event, and that event continues long after the hull goes under. A boat sinks on a bend, maybe a colonial barge loaded with iron tools and cloth, maybe a rubber boom steamer, maybe a modern ferry. The river is already restless that day. Current shears under the hull, sand is being pushed up into bars, the outer bank is quietly eroding. Within hours, the structure begins to break, light wooden superstructures peel off and drift away. Loose cargo, sacks, crates, baskets, floats, rips open, spills. What doesn't float is heavy. Iron, ceramics, stone ballast. Those things plunge and hit the bed with force, sometimes burying themselves instantly in soft mud, sometimes bouncing and rolling down some unseen slope into deeper scour. A few days later, a flood wave arrives from upstream. The whole channel thickens with sediment. That same bend may now be eating its bank a little faster, deepening its outside curve. Sand avalanches down the underwater slope, sliding over whatever fell there earlier in the week. What was once a boat is now a tangle of fragments caught in a moving landslide. Give it a season, a year, a decade, and the site is no longer a site at all. The hull may be gone, dissolved or eaten, dragged away in pieces by subsequent floods. The cargo is no longer a coherent pile, but a scatter, potsherds here, metal fastenings there, a few denser objects that happen to come to rest in small hollows, or behind submerged logs. Then the channel migrates. The active thalweg shifts a few dozen meters. The place where the boat went down is no longer in deep water. It might be under a sandbar this flood season, under a shallow shoal the next, under forest in a human lifetime. So underwater archaeology in the Amazon is not often about intact wrecks. It is about fragments that have been rearranged by forces far more powerful than gravity alone. And the Amazon is hard on the objects themselves. Organic material that might survive in cold, oxygen-poor ocean depths is in trouble here. Warm water accelerates decay. Microbes and fungi thrive. Wood that isn't quickly buried in anoxic mud will soften, delaminate, and disappear. Ropes, textiles, leather, plant fibre, anything that carried the fine texture of daily life rot away unless they find one of the river's rare preservation microenvironments. Those special pockets do exist, in places where the bed is made of fine, waterlogged mud with little oxygen. A fallen log can be entombed and last for centuries, even millennia, slowly turning to a dark, heavy, almost stone-like material. In such settings, wooden hull timbers, paddles, or dugout canoes might survive, sealed in an underwater peat. Iron, however, will corrode rapidly in those same conditions. In slightly more oxygenated zones, the opposite can happen. Metal fittings persist as wood vanishes around them, leaving a ghost outline of a once coherent structure. This patchiness makes interpretation precarious. An archaeologist might find a line of corroded nails or bolts in the mud. Are they all that's left of a hull that has otherwise decayed? Or are they a handful of loose fittings washed in from somewhere else, concentrated by a quirk in the flow? Without the rest of the material culture, the pottery, the wooden boxes, the organic cargo, the story is incomplete. Then there are the river's own creations, which mimic human debris a little too well. Submerged trees, root balls, and whole rafts of tangled branches circulate through the channel. They snag on the bottom and become what river people sometimes call mattresses or gardens, dense, three-dimensional thickets that trap anything moving by. To sonar, these can look like complex, solid structures. To a diver, they are a nightmare of snag points, hidden currents, and zero visibility. To an archaeologist, they are both hazard and confusion, because they also capture artifacts. Bottles, tools, modern trash, creating artificial sites that never had any historical coherence. Add shifting sands to that. Sandbars grow and shrink with each flood. They form on the insides of bends along mid-channel ridges at confluences. A wreck that happens to settle near one of these is quickly colonized. Horizontal surfaces are dusted with fine grains, then draped in thicker layers as each high water adds a little more. What is visible one year may be a metre deep the next. The bar itself may then migrate, sliding laterally across the channel floor, bulldozing the half-buried remains in front of it, and leaving a tail of disturbed sediment behind. Trying to document an archaeological site in these conditions raises problems that go right to the core of the discipline. One of the most important concepts in archaeology is provenience, the exact three-dimensional position of each object in relation to every other object and to the site as a whole. That spatial context is what lets you say, this pot was by that hearth, or these beads were probably part of the same garment. In the Amazon, water energy happily rearranges provenience after the fact. Objects of different sizes and densities move differently in turbulent flow. Light things hop along the bed, heavy ones stay put until a big event shoves them. Pieces dropped together can end up meters or tens of meters apart. Over multiple floods, the pattern becomes more dispersive still. By the time someone finds a bronze tool on a low-water sandbar, it may be far from where it entered the river, far from any associated material, its archaeological address erased. Repeatability is another casualty. In classical underwater archaeology, once you've charted a wreck, you can come back to the same markers year after year, refining your map. In the Amazon, buoy markers get torn out by debris or simply stranded as the channel shifts. GPS helps, but when the very shape of the river bottom has changed between visits, the reference frame is different. A promising anomaly detected by sonar one dry season may be gone the next, not because it was never there, but because the river has covered it with new layers or carved it away. And then there is the question of site protection. On land, a known archaeological site can be fenced, guarded, quietly monitored. Underwater in the Amazon, most sites are invisible and effectively unguardable. News of a wreck or a find can travel quickly along river communities, drawing not only curious neighbours, but also those hoping for saleable metal, curiosity objects, or rumoured treasures. The line between legitimate salvage, local reuse, and outright looting can be thin, especially where economic options are limited and state presence is weak. Responsible archaeologists have to navigate this human current as carefully as the physical one. They work, when possible, with local communities, emphasizing that these finds are part of a shared history, not just a source of quick cash. They move slowly, documenting as thoroughly as conditions allow, often choosing not to publicize precise locations to avoid attracting unwanted attention. They prioritize conservation and context over spectacular objects, even when funders, media, or collectors might prefer a dramatic story of lost ships of the Amazon and chests of colonial silver. Because that treasure hunting narrative is always just off stage. The idea that somewhere under the brown water lie galleons full of gold, rubber barons' fortunes, or crashed planes packed with valuables is compelling. Stories circulate along the river, mixing fact and legend, and sometimes valuable materials really are found. But an archaeological approach asks a different question. Not what can we take from the river, but what can we learn? And how do we leave the record as intact as possible for future study, in an environment where the record is already being constantly edited by sediment, current, decay, and channel migration? That restraint matters even more. Every object ripped from its remaining context without documentation is a sentence torn from an already tattered page. Every unrecorded disturbance, an anchor dragged through a buried layer, a sand dredge cutting into an old channel, a treasure hunt that leaves no notes, adds another smudge to an already blurred story. So the Amazon keeps most of its shipwrecks and artifacts in a kind of moving obscurity. A few will surface, literally and figuratively, in the right circumstances. A drought that drops water levels unusually low, an eroding bank that coughs up a canoe, a sonar pass that catches a pattern too regular to be natural. But the majority remains scattered, buried, or dissolved into the background of sand and wood and clay. The river remembers that they were there. It remembers by the slight change in how a bar builds over a buried log, by the altered turbulence around a half-buried beam, by trace metals slowly leaching into the water. For human memory, for our desire to understand how people have moved on, and across this waterway, those whispers are hard to hear, and to listen for them without drowning out the rest of the story requires patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that much of the Amazon's human past may never be neatly mapped on the channel floor, but instead lives in other archives, stories along the banks, traditions of navigation, names passed down for dangerous bends and safe passages. To follow those threads, we have to leave the submerged wrecks for a moment and turn to the people who have lived with this river for thousands of years. If you stand on the deck of a modern research boat in the central Amazon, GPS blinking, radar turning, laptop screens glowing with bathymetric maps, you are still never alone out there. Somewhere nearby is a small wooden canoe, a narrow dugout, a long, low boat with an outboard patched together from spare parts. In it, someone is reading the river in a different language. For many indigenous peoples along the Amazon and its tributaries, the river is not just a channel to be measured. It is a relative, a route, a boundary, a memory palace. It has moods, it has obligations, it has places that are generous and places that are dangerous, not only in the physical sense, but in the social and spiritual sense as well. Along some stretches, every bend has a name, every sandbar a story. There are bends where a specific fish is known to spawn when the water reaches a certain mark on the tree trunks. Channels that are safe to cross only when a certain constellation appears just before dawn. Backwaters that are good for turtles if the first floods of the year come early. Bad for them if the water rises in a quick, hot pulse. This knowledge is thick with detail, but it is not just a list of facts. It is lived practice. An experienced river navigator may not talk about shear stress or secondary flow, but they know when the boat's bow begins to shudder that an underwater tree is twisting in the current beneath them. They listen for subtle changes in sound, the hollow slap of waves against a submerged log, the hiss of fast water over shallow sand, the deep, almost inaudible rumble that means the current is biting into the outer bank. They read colour too. Water carrying white sand from one tributary looks different from black water stained with tannins from another. Fine differences in shade tell you which branch of a fork will deepen into a main channel and which will strand you on a shoal when the water drops. And they read time. They know the sequence of the flood pulse, the way others know the days of the week. The first rise that wakes up the fish, the plateau that fills the lakes, the late flood that threatens gardens planted on fresh silt, the tiny changes a certain insect chorus, the smell of rotting leaves under the forest, a familiar log finally going under that say the water is about to jump another hand span overnight. To outside scientists, this body of knowledge can look like a ready-made dataset waiting to be captured. Map the named places. Record the stories, turn seasonal cues into models. Feed it all into algorithms that might predict where channels will move, where fish will be at different water levels, where submerged hazards concentrate. But there is a problem with imagining knowledge as something you can scoop up like water. Much of what river peoples know is not meant to be detached from the relationships that created it. Some stories are shared openly, others only within a clan or a ritual context. Certain names are not supposed to be spoken to outsiders. Sacred sites, springs, confluences, whirlpools, stretches of bank are sometimes deliberately left vague when maps are drawn, not because the knowledge is lacking, but because its protection depends on its partial invisibility. There is also the lived memory of extraction. For centuries, outsiders have come to the Amazon looking for things to take: rubber, timber, minerals, animals, plants, labour, and more recently data. Biological samples, genetic sequences, traditional remedies, navigation routes, place-based stories. Each new wave often promises partnership, development, or scientific progress. Not all of those promises are kept, so when researchers arrive asking, where is it deep? Where is it dangerous? Where are the fish? There is a history in the background, a question about what will happen to that information, who will own it, who will profit from it, and whether it will circle back in ways that benefit or harm the people who shared it. Because of this, some of the limits on exploring what is beneath the Amazon are not physical at all. They are social and ethical. You may have the best sonar array in the world, but you will not be invited to certain lakes. You may propose to scan a confluence for buried channels, and local leaders may say no or yes under strict conditions, or yes but only if the work is co-designed, the results are shared in accessible ways, and the community decides what can be published. In the more careful projects, that is exactly what happens. Researchers sit with elders and fishers and river pilots before any instruments are switched on, listening first. They spread out satellite images and ask, where does the current change? Where did your grandparents say the channel used to be? Which places should we not record? The map is then drawn together, with some places marked, others intentionally left blank. Sometimes Indigenous monitors travel with the scientific team, watching not only the equipment, but the process itself. They help decide where to focus surveys, when to stop for a day because a ritual is taking place on the banks, which anomalies on a sonar trace might actually be an old submerged tree that everyone knows about already and not a discovery at all. Knowledge flows both ways in these collaborations. High-resolution depth profiles can confirm what river pilots have long said about hidden ridges and deep holes. Local explanations about why a certain backwater steals boats can prompt hydrodynamic modelling of eddies that were not obvious from satellite data alone. Decisions about whether to publicise a newly found feature, a buried paleo-channel, a possible ancient canoe, are made with community input, not just academic curiosity. This is a slower kind of exploration. It respects the idea that some aspects of the river's underworld are not just physically hard to reach, but socially protected. That certain knowledge stays along the banks, carried in memory and practice, not because people are hiding it in any simple sense, but because their survival and identity depend on controlling how and where it circulates. From the outside, this can look like a barrier, another frustrating limit on our ability to fully map the Amazon from surface to bed. From another angle, it is simply a recognition that rivers are not empty spaces to be instrumented. They are inhabited worlds, and any exploration that forgets that ends up shallow, no matter how deep its sonar can see. As Colonial-Era explorers would learn, sailing past these same banks with their own instruments and assumptions, having a boat and a compass and a sounding line, does not mean you understand where you are, or what the river is really keeping from you. So when Europeans began pushing up the Amazon in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were arriving in a place that was already thick with names, rules and histories, but they did not see it that way. On paper, their goals were clear. They were looking for routes, the fabled passage across the continent that might link the Atlantic to the Pacific, or at least to silver in the Andes. They were looking for resources, spices, dyes, hardwoods, and especially people who could be turned into labour for plantations and mines. They were looking for claims, lines on maps that could be argued over in European courts, flags that could be planted and backed up later with retroactive paperwork, and they were looking for something else that mattered a great deal in imperial capitals. Numbers, distances travelled per day, angles of tributaries, widths of channels, soundings of depth, lists of villages and how many souls lived in each one. A certain thickness of the river had to be flattened into reports, turned into text and sketch maps that could be mailed home, read aloud and filed. But the instruments they carried, and the bodies that carried them, were fragile things in that environment. A compass could get you a bearing, yes, but the constant turnings of the river twisted direction until north was an abstraction. To measure latitude, you needed clear horizon and steady hands for a sextant, or its early predecessors. On the Amazon, your horizon was walls of forest, your hands were mosquito-bitten and feverish, and the sky was often a sheet of cloud. Depth could be probed with a sounding line, a rope or cord with a lead weight, dropped over the side and counted in fathoms. That worked well in harbours and coastal shallows. In a big river with a strong current, the line drifted, bellied, snagged on floating branches. You got a number, but it was smeared by motion, by the captain's guess about when the weight had really touched bottom. Then there was disease, scurvy carried over from the sea, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, parasites with no comfortable names. Expeditions lost men faster than they lost boats. Journals break off mid-sentence, continued in another hand, or not continued at all. Survey plans that looked precise in Lisbon or Madrid became impossible when half the crew was delirious and the rest were hauling sick comrades upriver. Logistics frayed too. Powder got damp. Instruments warped in the humidity. Paper-moulded replacement parts were months away, if they existed at all. There were no telegraphs yet, no radios. A decision made at a fork in the river might not be known in the capital for a year, if ever. It is in this gap between the neat goals and the messy reality that rumour and misunderstanding began to seep into the record. An Indigenous pilot might indicate a deep, dangerous channel ahead, a place to avoid. By the time that caution reached a European chronicler, filtered through translators' fear and expectation, it might appear as a bottomless channel which local people dread as enchanted, its depth exaggerated, its hazards turned into demons or dragons of the water. Reports of large, well-organised riverine societies could enter European texts as hints of great cities in the interior, precursors to the myth of El Dorado. A rich floodplain dotted with fields became a kingdom of unimaginable wealth. A temporary fishing camp glimpsed in high water became evidence of a continuous chain of settlements hugging a single vast channel that did not really exist in that form. Measurements and myth were tangled together. A pilot might faithfully note that at a certain bend, the lead line never hit bottom at 30 fathoms. That might be true for that season, that particular combination of flood and scoured channel. But on a map drawn months later, in a different climate, it became a fixed label, deep beyond soundings, as if the river there was permanently unfathomable. The scale of the Amazon encouraged this kind of exaggeration. When you have been rowing for weeks and the banks still roll by, when tributaries as wide as European rivers join from the side with no apparent effect on the main flow, your sense of proportion starts to drift. Depths feel deeper, distances longer, currents stronger than anything you have known before. If you are trying to impress a patron at court, or convince a crown to fund another voyage, there is also an incentive to lean into the vastness, to speak confidently of the main channel, the true source, the great cataract you have found, even when your own logbook is full of question marks and crossed-out courses. So early accounts of the Amazon give us both less and more than we might think. Less because they could not see the river's moving bottom, its shifting sand waves and buried trees and paleochannels. Their instruments were too crude, their time too short, their health too fragile to do more than scratch at the surface. More because into that uncertainty they poured stories of golden cities, of bottomless pools, of monstrous fish and peoples who lived half in the water. Some of these tales preserved shadows of real things, floodplain chiefdoms, giant catfish, treacherous whirlpools. Others were projections, Europe's hopes and fears painted onto a river it barely touched. Those early expeditions left a long legacy. They taught later generations to expect that the Amazon could be reduced to a single line on a map, a single true channel to be traced from source to sea. They implied that with enough courage and rope and ink, the river would finally give up its secrets and fit neatly inside the pages of an atlas. Modern exploration still carries some of those expectations. We send sonar instead of sounding lines, satellites instead of sketch maps, but we sometimes inherit the same confidence, the belief that a complete, final picture of what lies beneath the Amazon is just one more expedition away. The river, meanwhile, continues to move, to erase yesterday's soundings and redraw its own bed in the dark. Today, on paper, things look far more organised. Instead of a royal decree and a wooden caravel, a modern river survey begins with a proposal document the thickness of a small book. You have to explain exactly what you want to do, how many days on the water, what stretches of river, what instruments you'll use, what questions you're trying to answer. You attach budgets, boats to charter, fuel to buy, salaries for technicians who know how to coax data out of multibeam sonars and sub-bottom profilers, insurance, satellite phones, spare parts that might never be needed, but which would be catastrophic to lack when you're 10 days upriver and the nearest hardware store is an airplane flight and 2 motorized canoes away. Very quickly, a romantic notion of exploring the Amazon turns into line items measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's before you even set foot on a dock. Because the Amazon is not one thing administratively, any more than it is physically. Its basin sprawls across several modern countries, each with its own environmental regulations, research councils, and layers of local authority. A survey that crosses an international border means separate permits on each side, often from multiple agencies, one to collect water samples, another to operate sonar, another to work near indigenous territories, another if your work might touch a protected area or a shipping lane. Each office has its own calendars, its own priorities, its own questions. Who will own the data? Where will it be stored? Are there Brazilian students on the team, Peruvian students, Colombian? Will local communities be consulted, compensated, informed? What happens if you stumble across cultural material, a carved log canoe buried in silt timbers that might belong to a Colonial-Era wreck? Weeks on the water are preceded by months, sometimes years, of negotiation. Meanwhile, the equipment you hope to use waits in crates and warehouses. It is clever, delicate, and mostly designed for oceans and temperate harbours, not for a river that is, in engineering terms, constantly trying to eat it. Just getting it there is an expedition inside the expedition. Crates move from cargo planes to trucks, from trucks to riverboats, from riverboats to smaller launches that can navigate shallower channels. Lifting a multi-beam sonar head, the size of a suitcase onto a small hull, requires improvisation, ropes, pulleys, extra hands, and careful timing with the current. Once in place, the river begins to work on it. Humidity seeps into seals and connectors. Warm, muddy water carries organic slime that coats housings and sensors. Fine silt infiltrates moving parts. Electronics that behave perfectly in a climate-controlled lab start misbehaving after a week of heat and condensation. A $200 cable corrodes and fails, and suddenly a $200,000 instrument is blind. So you bring backups, and backups for the backups. Redundant power supplies, desiccant packs, canisters of compressed air to blow mud out of cooling fins, bags of silica gel tucked into every case, daily rituals of drying and checking, tightening and taping. And still, things go wrong. So you plan for that too. In the old chronicles, the only way off the river when things went bad was to turn around, or to die. Modern fieldwork carries a different kind of responsibility. If someone is injured or becomes acutely ill, you are expected to have a plan that moves faster than the current. Before a survey starts, you plot evacuation routes almost the way the old pilots plotted channels. Where is the nearest airstrip that can handle a small plane? Is there a village with a radio? A clinic with basic supplies? How long does it take a fast boat to reach a hospital in the regional capital, assuming the motor doesn't fail, assuming the water level doesn't drop unexpectedly? You carry medical kits that look like scaled-down emergency rooms. Antibiotics, antimalarials, IV fluids, splints, snakebite protocols if you're in areas where venomous species are common. Someone on the team is trained in advanced first aid. Everyone has rehearsed what to do if a propeller cuts a leg, if a branch comes through the hull, if a storm comes down with the kind of sudden violence the tropics specialize in. Communication threads through all of this. Satellite phones that must be tested, rationed, protected from water. GPS beacons that ping your position to a coordinator far away, who watches your slow progress as a dotted line across a digital map. Schedules for daily check-ins that become almost ritual. We are here. Everyone is well, equipment functioning, weather stable, and always the weather. The river you planned for in a funding proposal might not be the river you meet, A delayed rainy season can strand boats on sandbars that didn't exist in last year's satellite imagery. An early flood can transform a narrow, well-defined channel into a watery maze where navigation markers vanish into drowned forest. You watch forecasts, barometers, cloud formations, but there are limits to prediction in a system this big. So you build in margins, extra days for delays, extra fuel in case currents are stronger than expected. Routes that include sheltered anchorages where you can ride out storms if they materialize. Put this all together, and the pattern becomes clear. Most projects do not set out to truly explore the Amazon in the old, totalizing sense. They choose narrow questions and carefully bounded stretches, a single confluence, a few tens of kilometers of main channel, one season's worth of data. Not because scientists and surveyors lack curiosity, but because the river, the bureaucracy, the budget, and the basic obligation to bring people home alive all press inwards, narrowing ambition. The dream of a complete map of everything beneath the Amazon remains just that, a dream. What we get instead are mosaics, pieces gathered here and there from expeditions that were never as grand as the river itself, but were as large as money, law, and safety would allow. And then, even if the money appears, the instruments survive the humidity. The schedules line up and the storms hold off. You reach another kind of limit. The river does not lie in a legal vacuum. Much of it is already spoken for, not just by states, but by parks, reserves, territories, and people whose lives are interwoven with particular bends and channels. On a map in an office, a stretch of river might be labelled with a thin green wash: National Park, Extractive Reserve, Sustainable Use Area, Indigenous Land. To a satellite, it looks like endless forest. To a research team, that thin green wash is a wall of rules. Some protected areas are designed precisely to keep out the kind of intensive activity that detailed mapping requires. Noise that might disturb wildlife, boats that churn up banks, anchors that could scar a fragile riverbed. Legally they exist to conserve ecosystems, not to satisfy curiosity about what lies under the turbid surface. So a biologist who wants to count river dolphins might be welcomed, while a geophysicist who wants to tow a heavy sonar array back and forth all day meets a different answer. Sometimes the answer is simply no, other times it is yes, but. Yes, but only on certain days. Yes, but only with smaller equipment. Yes, but stay away from known nesting sites, from sacred inlets, from the quiet backwaters where fish breed. Each condition narrows the slice of river that can actually be examined. If you zoom out from parks and reserves, a second layer appears: sovereignty. For centuries, outsiders treated the Amazon as a borderless wilderness, free to be mapped, measured, divided in whatever way suited the mapmaker. That era is over. Today, every sounding, every sediment core, every high-resolution image is gathered inside a national jurisdiction with its own sensitivities. This matters more than it might seem at first glance. A detailed bathymetric map is not just a picture of pretty underwater sand waves. To a government, it can be strategic information. It can reveal where navigation channels might be dredged deeper for more shipping, where hidden gravel bars could strand barges, where submerged ridges might anchor a future dam. It can also hint at what lies beside the river. Certain patterns in the bed can point to buried paleochannels that sometimes coincide with oil and gas deposits, or with mineral-rich terraces along the banks. Suddenly, a scientific survey and a resource exploration map begin to look uncomfortably similar. So ministries ask careful questions. Who will own the raw data? Will it be uploaded to open databases in Europe or North America? Will foreign companies be able to download it, combine it with seismic profiles, and claim they discovered a new prospect on their own? What happens if maps of a remote reach of river line up perfectly with rumours of gold or rare earths? In a world where environmental law, indigenous rights, and industrial lobbying all intersect, these are not abstract concerns. They are the quiet battles that shape what research is permitted and where. Layered on top of that is another tension: development versus protection. Along some tributaries, hydroelectric projects promise cheap power. Barge traffic promises export corridors. Mining promises jobs. Each promise comes wrapped in environmental impact assessments, in consultants' reports, in technical studies that sometimes use the same instruments scientists use to probe the hidden riverbed. If you arrive with an echo sounder and a proposal full of terms like sub-bottom structure and channel morphology, local officials may want reassurance that you're not an advanced scout for extraction. Conservation groups may worry you are providing the data that will help someone else argue later that a dam site is ideal. In other places, it works the other way round. Communities that have seen forests cut and fish stocks decline are suspicious not of science, but of development. They may welcome researchers as potential allies, people who can document erosion, mercury contamination, or bank collapse in ways that courts and journalists will take seriously. In both cases, the same sonar pinging off the same muddy bottom is interpreted through different political lenses. And then there is consent at the most local scale of all. Much of the Amazon runs alongside or directly through indigenous territories and traditional communities that have legal standing in decisions about what happens on their waters. A permit from the capital is not enough if the people who live by that river bend say no. Consent here is not a signature on a form obtained in a single visit. It is a relationship. You sit beneath a thatched roof, explain what you want to do in unhurried conversation. People ask, will the machines scare away fish? Will the maps show outsiders where to come and take timber, or sand, or turtle eggs? Will the images include burial grounds under the floodplain? Places that should not be broadcast? Sometimes what they want in return is money, but more often it is information in a form that matters to them. Copies of maps they can use in land claims. Training for local youth. A promise that if your work uncovers something sensitive, a burial mound eroding from a bank, an ancestral canoe deep in the mud, you will not publish the exact coordinates without their agreement. There are also places where the answer is an unambiguous refusal. No boats with instruments. No outsiders, no photographs, no drones, no GPS tracks. Entire reaches of the river become black boxes by deliberate choice. Left unmeasured, not because they are too remote, but because the people who live there have weighed the risks and benefits and decided that mystery is safer than exposure. From a pure exploration standpoint, these look like obstacles. Closed doors, redacted lines on an imaginary perfect map. But from another angle, they are a form of protection. The very fact that we cannot truly explore every metre of the Amazon's hidden bottom is in part a consequence of lessons learned the hard way. That openness can be exploited, that knowledge is power, that rivers whose every contour is known become easier to dam, dredge, and strip. So the unknowable parts of the Amazon are not just the product of mud and darkness and fickle currents. They are also the product of decisions made in ministries, in village assemblies, in reserve councils that some knowledge should be bounded. The river keeps its secrets, in other words, not only because we lack the tools to see them, but because some of the people with the power to grant access have decided, for now, that those secrets should remain where they are. If you pull back from the politics and the permits, past the meetings and the careful refusals, you arrive at a quieter question. Given everything we know and everything we don't, what might still be down there? Not in the sense of treasure maps and lost cities, but in the more modest, more interesting sense of patterns. Hidden structures, things that fit with what we understand of rivers, of history, of people. The kinds of discoveries that wouldn't overturn science, but would gently refine it. The first category is geological, the ghost rivers under the river. Every great river builds its own archaeology in mud. As the Amazon has twisted and wandered over hundreds of thousands of years, it has abandoned old courses and carved new ones. Those former paths, called paleochannels, do not vanish. They sink. Beneath the present bed, there are likely buried valleys, some tens of meters deep, packed with coarser sand and gravel, capped by layers of finer silt. To a ship passing overhead, nothing distinguishes that spot from any other brown expanse. But to an instrument that can peer below the surface, very briefly, in very specific conditions, the outline of an ancient channel sometimes appears like a faint scar. Many of these have been mapped along the margins, near banks and floodplains. Far fewer are known beneath the active thalweg, the fast central current, where noise and turbulence make clean images rare. There, paleocanals may still lie untraced. Fossil meanders, cut-off loops, the buried beds of tributaries that no longer exist. They matter because they shape the present. A paleochannel filled with coarse sediment can act like a hidden keel, guiding where the modern river prefers to deepen. Another, packed with fine clay, may behave more like a cushion, encouraging the flow to slide and shift, creating shoals and eddies directly above. Somewhere under the opaque water, the ancient river is still quietly steering the modern one. Alongside those ghost rivers are hazards we know must exist, but rarely see in detail. Submerged tree trunks locked into the bed, for example. Whole drowned forests toppled by bank collapse, then pinned by fresh sediment. To navigation charts. Many of these are simply obstructions, if they're recorded at all. But in reality, they can form intricate logjam labyrinths, creating micro-habitats, redirecting currents, snagging nets and hulls. There are also likely boulder fields and debris fans at the mouths of certain tributaries, delivered in violent pulses during storms or landslides. Some we've charted, others remain statistical guesses. Places where the energy of a side river suggests coarse material should accumulate, but where no one has dragged a sensor along the bottom long enough to be sure. And then there are the living hotspots. Even in a river that looks uniformly brown, life is rarely evenly spread. Small changes in depth, flow speed or substrate can create oases, patches of gravel that certain fish need to spawn, scoured depressions that hold cooler water in the dry season, abrupt steps in the bed that generate oxygen-rich turbulence. We've identified some of these ecological nodes because local fishers know them, or because a research boat happened to pass over with the right instruments at the right moment. But the Amazon is vast, and our sampling is thin. There are almost certainly countless micro-refugia on the bottom, nursery grounds, feeding shelves, cold pockets, that have never been mapped, and perhaps never even named by the people who depend on them, simply folded into a broader understanding of that could bend over there. All of this concerns the river as a physical and biological system. But what about culture? What about the traces of people? Here, plausibility and humility have to travel together. For thousands of years, humans have moved along and across the Amazon and its tributaries. Where there are crossings, there are losses, canoes swamped in storms, cargo knocked into deep holes, offerings deliberately consigned to the water, perhaps even the occasional body buried in a channel that later shifted away. It is entirely reasonable to imagine carved paddles, ceramic vessels, woven baskets preserved in anoxic mud under certain conditions. In other river systems, such things have been found remarkably intact. It is also reasonable to think that wooden structures, pilings from ancient fish weirs, for instance, might survive where they were quickly entombed in sediment. But the same forces that make the Amazon opaque also conspire to erase and scatter its archaeology. The bed is not a shelf, it is a conveyor belt. Ridges migrate, scour holes deepen and fill, banks slump, whole sections of bottom are planed off in a flood and rebuilt downstream. Cultural materials, if they reach the bed, are pushed, rolled, buried, exhumed and broken over and over again. This means we are unlikely to find long, undisturbed underwater sites the way we do in calm lakes or on ocean floors. More often, if anything, the river will yield isolated objects far from where they were originally lost. A pot shirred in a dredge bucket, a carved fragment snagged in a net. Even those possibilities have to be weighed against the sheer area of the river and the sparse, opportunistic nature of our searching. For every dramatic story about a canoe found in the mud, there are millions of cubic meters of sediment that have never been touched by a human tool. In this kind of landscape, scientists learn to speak in probabilities, not promises. Instead of saying there is or there is not, they say it is likely or it is consistent with. Hypotheses are framed like careful bets, given what we know about how rivers behave elsewhere, and given a handful of measurements here. What is the most plausible configuration of channels and deposits beneath this reach? Models are run. Maps are shaded not in solid lines but in gradients of confidence. A paleochannel here with medium probability, a high chance of coarse bed material there, low certainty about depth over this shoal. The language is deliberately cautious, not because scientists fear being wrong, but because the river keeps reminding them how provisional each picture is. Peer review in this context becomes a kind of collective humility. One researcher's elegant reconstruction of a buried valley is checked against another's seismic line, a third's core sample, a fourth's satellite-derived flood pattern. Where they agree, confidence grows. Where they do not, the map quietly blurs again. And all the while, technology inches forward. Future sonar systems will likely be better at piercing through bubbles and turbidity, using different frequencies or clever signal processing to extract faint echoes from the chaos of suspended sediment. Autonomous surface and underwater craft, able to loiter for weeks without a crew, could patiently mow the river in fine grids, gathering dense swaths of data even in dangerous or remote reaches. On top of those raw measurements, machine learning tools may help sift patterns that human eyes miss, subtle signatures of buried channels, recurring shapes that hint at certain bed forms or debris fields, anomalies that might suggest something artificial on an otherwise natural bottom. Even then, the result will not be omniscience, just a slightly less fuzzy map, layered with slightly more nuanced probabilities. Somewhere in the middle of all this, between ghost rivers and log jams and possible fragments of old canoes, there is room for something softer as well, curiosity that doesn't demand closure. By the way, for listeners who like to drift off with longer stories like this, the channel's book, full of slow unfolding histories and deep time journeys, is available at sleepytimehistory.com, with a quiet little discount running this week, if and only if you feel like exploring further. Because in the end, wondering what might still be down there is part of the river's spell. Not as a puzzle we are obliged to solve, but as a reminder that even in an age of satellites and sensors and algorithms, there are still places where our knowledge thins out, where the line between what we can say and what we can only imagine remains pleasingly wide. Under the Amazon's moving skin, most of what exists will never be named, never be diagrammed, never be rendered as a neat cross-section in a paper. It will simply be shifting channels, buried valleys, swirling fish, quiet logs, maybe a pot shirred here and there, sleeping in the dark. And we on the surface will go on building careful models, refining our instruments, and updating our probabilities, while the river continues, as it always has, to keep most of its story to itself. So when we say we can't truly explore what's beneath the Amazon, it isn't a confession of failure. It's a description of the rules of the place. The riverbed is always on the move, reshaped by sediment pouring off thousands of slopes and banks. The water above it is thick with silt, scattering light, swallowing cameras, turning even the most advanced sensors into guesswork at exactly the depths we'd most like to see. The currents that do the carving are the same ones that make long, close-up work dangerous, flicking aside divers and dragging at cables. On top of that are the quieter constraints, the sheer size of the system, too long and too wide to cover in fine detail, the political and ethical boundaries that say, quite reasonably, that some stretches are off limits, some species too fragile, some communities' wishes more important than another data set. Put together, it means the Amazon doesn't really have a bottom in the tidy sense, a map suggests. It has a shape for this year, and a different one for the next flood season, and another buried underneath, written in layers of old channels and old storms. It isn't a static thing to be finished and filed away. It is a process, and we are watching one thin moment in its long, ongoing rearrangement. What remains, then, is not a checklist of missing discoveries, but a set of open questions. How do ghost channels influence the floods that will come 50 years from now? How many of those small biological refuges are out there, quietly nursing species we haven't even named? How far back do the human traces go? And how much of that story will forever stay dispersed, ground into sand and mud? Those questions don't have to be solved tonight. They can just sit beside you as you drift off, part of the gentle awareness that some things are meant to stay partly unknown. If you'd like to hear more slow journeys like this, you can support the channel by tapping like, leaving a comment, and subscribing. I'd love to know where you're listening from. If you feel like sharing, just write your city, or your country, or by a river in the comments. And if you're curious about the deeper backstory of our species, the long ages, the bottlenecks, the prehistoric secrets we touched on earlier, there's a book waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. You can read more about it there, and if it feels right, pick up a copy to keep by the bedside. For now, the Amazon will continue flowing through the dark, carrying its silt and its secrets, and we can let that mystery keep us company as the night gets a little quieter.